Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Radical Democracy Show. I'm your host, Kamali Rose.
And I'm the co-host, Kwame Norval.
And we are here today. First and foremost, as always, just right off the bat, we want to thank all of our supporters. Deeply appreciate all the support that we get on Coffee, on Patreon. We could not do this without you. So, we deeply appreciate that. Please, immediately, just as you're watching this, hit the like button down below, subscribe to the channel if you're not already subscribed, and please share this out on social media, especially if you hear something interesting that you like. Please share it out and help us spread the word. We want to give a special thanks to our newest supporter on Coffee and now an administrator for our Discord channel, Independent Left News. You can find links to independentleft.news's website and Twitter in the description below. You can also find links to where you can support us on Coffee, on Patreon also. So please just hit those links and show some support if you can afford to do so, and only if you can afford to do so. Do not feel any burden to do it. If you can't afford it, we appreciate your support and just showing up and engaging with us. So today we have a really special show plan. We're super excited to bring on our guest. So we'll get right to it. We have a special guest today with us. Tamanisha J. John is a Ph.D. candidate of international relations at Florida International University, where she studies Caribbean development, economic imperialism, financial exclusion, and Canadian overseas banking. She joins us on the Radical Democracy Show today to discuss the anti-woke leftist response to so-called cancel culture, the recent CIA recruitment ad, and intersectionality, as well as Israel's violent colonization of Palestinians and the manufacturing of consent by the U.S. media and politicians. So, with no further ado, let's get Tamanisha on here with us. Hi, Tamanisha.
Hi.
Thank you so much for joining us today. We really appreciate that.
Thank you so much for having me this evening.
Awesome. So what I'd like to do is just to sort of get the conversation going. Of course, right now we know of most people, if you're paying attention to the news, and if you're paying attention to the show, odds are you're paying attention to the news. You are aware of the violent actions by the Israeli military and police against the Palestinian people. There was a recent string of events that really began. This is the Muslim religious holiday of Eid, and there was at Al-Aqsa Mosque in Jerusalem, 300 Palestinians were shot and shot with rubber-coated steel bullets, tear gassed by Israeli police forces. Then in response to that, the Hamas responded by firing some rockets towards Israel. One Israeli was lightly injured initially, and then in response to that, there were bombings in Gaza all the way through last night. We've seen those continuation of that escalation of violence. Initially there were 30 people reported dead, 9 of them children. It's now gone to above 100 people dead. And what I wanted to start first by just sharing this clip this is a clip from Democracy Now!, where they are discussing these events. And so I just wanted to play this clip out. It's about 2 minutes long, and then we're going to come back and discuss this. So give just 1 second while we cue this here. And
besieged territory ahead of a possible ground invasion. Israeli attacks have killed at least 31 Palestinian children, many under the age of 10. Gaza authorities report 40% of the victims in the Israeli strikes have been women and children. Residents of Khan Yunis describe huddling in their homes during the Eid al-Fitr holiday as bombs exploded around them.
This Eid, we can't enjoy the celebrations because our neighbors got hit. My neighbor and her daughter were killed. We are close. We are like one family. We're very sad. The Israeli forces stole the cheer of Eid from the children. We bought them new clothes, but they didn't wear them. They are terrified and panicked.
Over 830 Palestinians have been wounded so far this week, but Gaza's hospital systems are on the verge of collapse as doctors face shortages of medicine and recurring power outages. Many Palestinians in Gaza have been taking shelter in United Nations schools, even as the UN's Office for the Coordination of Humanitarian Affairs reports more than 24 Palestinian schools have been damaged by Israeli strikes. 8 people in Israel have been killed as Hamas continues to fire rockets from Gaza. Israel's rejected calls for a ceasefire. In a video message addressed to Palestinians, Israeli Defense Minister Benny Gantz blamed Hamas for the violence and threatened that, quote, Gaza will burn.
Okay, so I just want to play that much of the clip for now. I'm going to play a little bit more. I want to play some of Joe Biden's remarks, but I first wanted to just ask you, Tamanisha, how would you describe and define the situation in Palestine? What is the media seems to report this as a conflict or clashes, and oftentimes it feels like they are equivocating the violence on both sides. And so I think that just to sort of give us a starting point of reference, can you tell us how you would define the situation there? Is it accurate to call this a conflict, a war, ethnic cleansing, settler colonialism? What terms should we apply to this situation? Terms like apartheid, what terms are appropriate in this situation?
Mm-hmm. So I think that it's undeniable that Israel is an occupying force in Palestine, largely because it's carrying out a colonization mission. And its colonization mission, it's also referred to, people also say it's apartheid because you do have two separate systems for Israeli citizens and Palestinians within the territories. But it is also the case that the goal or the stated mission of the Zionist project in occupied Palestine is to create a quote unquote Jewish state. And in its want or end goal to create and facilitate this quote unquote Jewish state, in order to do that, it must get rid of the Palestinians within occupied Palestine. And so to call it apartheid is accurate. To call it an occupying force as well as a colonizing one is also accurate. And to point out that it is engaged in ethnic cleansing because its stated goal is to create a Jewish state is also accurate. What's not accurate is to refer to it as a conflict, because colonization itself is not a conflict. There is a force with power who is coming in to use that power in order to violently dispossess, displace, and kill people living on a land for itself. And it is also wrong to call it a war, because again, war implies that there are two sides who are going to war for something. But within Israeli occupation, you just have the occupation, the colonialism with the goals of creating a Jewish state that rids itself of Palestinians that, live in Palestine.
Okay, thank you so much for that. So is this something that, a lot of folks sort of, I feel like a lot of Americans, it seems, don't necessarily pay close attention to international events. It's kind of a global, we're looked at globally as somewhat ignorant and isolated in our way of thinking. We don't pay as much attention to international events, where other people have to pay attention to what America is doing typically because it is impacting their lives. I've lived, in Jamaica, for instance, where you have, what America does very much influences other parts of the world in ways that they don't necessarily influence our daily lives. And so is there a reason, what are the reasons why, first off, what is the US's connection to these events that are going on in Israel? Are we connected in any way? Does the US shoulder the blame in these events in any way?
So yes, I do think that the U.S. Shoulders the blame. Some of the language that I also see around it, I find a bit problematic because people like to point out, oh, the U.S. is complicit in Israel's occupation because it doesn't denounce this, or oh, our tax dollars are funding, Israel military violence, and so, we're complicit. But those arguments sort of paint the U.S. as sort of a passive aggressor in this conflict, when it's not the case that, Britain, the former empire, or the US, the current hegemonic one, are passively complicit. The reason that the US funds Israel's army with a substantive amount of monies, I think it was to the tune of almost $4 billion, is because by having that as a sort of satellite state in the region, US economic, political, and ideological interests could be carried out in the broader Middle Eastern region. And so it is not the case that the US is accidentally or, passive in this instance. The US funds Israel's occupation and militarization in the region because it wants to advance its own imperial interest in that region. And so a lot of the language around it is sort of passive when it should be active. We fund Israeli terror against Palestinians because it supports our economic, political, and ideological interests that we have in that region.
Amazing, and thank you for that. So I want to talk about specifically there seems to be a bipartisan perspective on this issue. Both the Democratic Party and the Republican Party appear to hold very similar views, at least within the establishment and the leadership of those two parties. So I wanted to quickly just play a clip of Joe Biden's response. Of course, we know recently folks like Andrew Yang have come out and been very vocal in support for Israel in their actions. Then Nancy Pelosi came out, gave a supportive statement to Israel. Joe Biden came out and gave supportive statements to Israel. And as well as folks like Ted Cruz and, and folks on the far right, Ben Shapiro and some far right figures as well. So it seems like all across from the sort of what they call the center left of the country, all the way to the far right appear to support these actions in Israel. And a lot of people seem to suggest that, Trump, it was uniquely bad and evil and had very bad sort of, policies within the Middle East, inciting, more tension there, for instance, withdrawing from the Iran nuclear deal. And the idea was that, well, with Joe Biden, we were going to get somebody that was like a real president and somebody that was serious and committed to, Democrats claim to be committed to things like, peace and justice, they claim. And so I wanted to play this clip from Joe Biden and then come back and get your thoughts about his response to it as well into these recent events in Gaza. Essentially, last night, I think that there were buildings were destroyed in Gaza. Some people are calling this the what is the term, the Kristallnacht. Kristallnacht, like a successor to the events of Kristallnacht, which is what happened in 1930s. It's essentially a pogrom against the Jewish people by the fascist Nazis, where they destroyed businesses, killed almost 100, over 100 people overnight. And so we've seen recent events like this play out in Gaza, and I wanted to play a clip here of Joe Biden responding to this recently, and then just come back and ask you a quick question on this as well.
Thursday reiterated his support for Israel's military campaign in Gaza, shrugging off concerns over the mounting Palestinian death toll.
And one of the things that I have seen thus far is that there has not been a significant overreaction.
Biden did not mention Palestine or Palestinians during Thursday's remarks from the White House. The Biden administration's blocked the UN Security Council from holding a meeting today on the crisis after twice blocking Security Council statements earlier this week.
Okay, so we have there Joe Biden saying there wasn't an overreaction by the Israeli forces, and also claiming that so essentially saying that there was not an overreaction to the actions of the Hamas and the Palestinian in the Palestinian forces. Do you agree with that? One, really, I think I know where you come down on that. Should this be surprising to somebody that's paying attention to what's going on with Joe Biden? Is this consistent with his rhetoric of the past, or is this a departure from the standard Democratic Party line and Joe Biden's positions as well?
So I think that when we talk about U.S. foreign policy and U.S. Foreign policy leaders, we have to keep in mind that no matter whether it's a Democrat or Republican in charge, they're both vested in U.S. imperialism and imperialism in general because it benefits this country. And not only this country, but it benefits a lot of the financiers that finance their campaigns. And Joe Biden, as someone who supported segregation in the 60s, 70s, 80s, and is caught saying racist remarks in the 2000s and also the 2010s, I'm not surprised that someone who is a segregationist, who also tacitly supported South African apartheid to some extent, would support Israel's occupation of Palestine. I think that something important to remember here is that a lot of the dependency work that came out in the 70s and 80s, you had a lot of states in the global South or third world who wanted to reaffirm their sovereignty, because sovereignty to them was the only way that they could assert any sort of power or say in a world that insisted on their uneven development and exploitation by the global North. And so when you look at Israel's occupation of Palestine, where Palestinians don't have the right to assert any sort of sovereignty or have any say in the violence that is enacted against them, in that sense, Palestinians in U.S. foreign policy and also under Israel's occupation over that land aren't even viewed as humans. And so if you don't view someone, or if you don't view a group of people as even belonging to the human race, then you can come up with any sort of justifications for not just why they deserve or it is justified for them to be killed, but also as to why you wouldn't even mention them anytime you refer to sort of conflict or war in the region. So you don't even acknowledge their existence. And so I think that when people harp on the fact like, oh, they didn't even mention Palestinians, it's because Palestinians didn't have the same rights to self-determination after independence that a lot of other countries in the global South did. And this isn't to say that countries of the global South don't see infringements against their sovereignty, because it happens all the time, but just that that same sort of extension of a sovereign Palestine was not extended to Palestinians, because you had European powers and later on the Americans who wanted the creation of a Jewish state there to act within its interest in the region.
Yeah, and I think folks that are watching the show are probably familiar with U.S.'s Monroe Doctrine and the impact of things like that on the sovereignty of nations in the global South and in South America, and so I think that is a. Do you see are there parallels there to how the U.S. treats?
So I just want to note that what I find very disheartening about the occupation of Palestine is how in the U.S. even intellectuals are afraid to approach the topic on Palestine. That in a lot of books on imperialism and colonialism, if you look at the index, Palestine won't even be mentioned. And I think that when we talk about how the U.S. is actively supporting Israel's occupation in Palestine, we have to keep in mind that the U.S. as an imperial power is a petty one. It's over half a century and we still have a blockade on Cuba, for instance. And so our ability to prolong Palestinian suffering until they are, quote unquote, ethnically cleansed or removed from the area is actually a very real threat. And it's sad that you have, not that many people that are willing to talk about this topic or even touch this topic. And I will say that the past few weeks, I've actually been very happy to see that even though the mainstream media is still going the mainstream media line, social media has seen sort of a shift in public opinion where people are talking about Palestine, because a few years ago, I would not have imagined that this would have been possible.
Yeah, I've been reading recently Cornel West's Democracy Matters, and he wrote that back in 2004, and parts of the book really are entirely dedicated to the occupation of Palestinian land by Israel. And even then, I can see in reading that the way that he talks about it, it was clear that he was still having to just begin the work of trying to sort of open people's eyes to the reality and to push progressive Democrats to speak up and speak out on this. Do you think that it sounds like you said that there has been sort of a paradigm shift, even within at least the progressive left or sort of the online left on this issue, where we're seeing much more vocal support of Palestinians? What is there anything that you would attribute that to in particular? Is this because popular politicians are, or is this because a few popular politicians, or Rashida Tlaib in the squad, Ilhan Omar, members of the so-called squad, have been speaking out about this recently? And then you have even someone like AOC, who initially, early on in her, when she first got into Congress in 2018, she seemed to have a less solidified position on it. She seems to be taking a slightly stronger tack now, even calling out Joe Biden and Andrew Yang on their statements. What do you feel like that shift is attributed to? Is that who's done that work, and why is that changing, do you think?
So I think a lot of the shift is attributable to Palestinian activists and also just Palestinian refugees. While it helps to have people like Rashida Tlaib and Ilhan Omar, that raises this to the level of U.S. government, where they are at least talking about Palestine in U.S. government, which before would not have been possible. I don't think that the sort of shift in public opinion that we see now is necessarily because of U.S. politicians. It is due to Palestinian activists that have been relentlessly organizing, even though they've been targeted, criminalized, and attacked by right-wing groups and also right-wing Israel diasporic groups in the U.S. And I also think it's because Palestinian refugees that talk about sort of the atrocities that happened to them in occupied Palestine raised sort of the level of scrutiny to the occupation to the level that we see now. But I don't think it's necessary. I think it's because of relentless organizing by Palestinian activists, by Palestinian refugees, which is not just something that was one and done, but it has been decades in the making that it finally reached to this point.
Thank you. Yeah. So, I've heard people, and even, in discussing it with some folks, giving some, a little too much credit, in my opinion, to the politicians and these folks, because I don't think that these things really happen from the top down necessarily. It's often, when we've seen any real change anywhere in the world, it's been sort of from the bottom up through grassroots movements. And so I think that that's I've seen to read it similarly as well as the work of the activists. Do you feel like this is enough to actually change policy, to shift policy in for the Democratic Party? And what do you think the U.S. could do in this situation to influence Israel in these actions? And do you think that it will actually get done?
Again, I feel as if language that talks about what can the U.S. do to influence Israel negates the fact that the U.S. has a vested interest in sort of Israeli occupation in Palestine. You can have members of the U.S. House floor, giving all of these lavish speeches and saying what they want to say. But at the end of the day, when Joe Biden gets out there and doesn't mention Palestine and Palestinians at all and says Israel's occupation is justified, then from that you will know that there is no change. I think something else to point out is that Joe Biden has not signed any nuclear deal or re-entered the nuclear deal with Iran. And so when you think about U.S. interests in the region, the U.S. maintains a vested interest in Israel's occupation of Palestine for its specific interests in that region. So I think it would be misguided to say, oh, we just need to lobby US politicians to change X, Y, and Z, because then that would mean that US politicians are responsive to people within the United States. And there has been, multiple books, research written on this, but US politicians are mostly interested or invested in the policy needs or the wants of who's investing in their campaigns, who's investing abroad. And U.S. militarization is actually a trillion-dollar industry at this point. And so they will continue selling arms for Israel to kill Palestinians and create a satellite state in the image that it prefers in order to see its interest extend into the Middle Eastern region.
I see. So, and thank you for that correction, because it shows how pervasive the issue is when even folks that, like myself, that claim to be, vowed leftists and staunch leftists and socialists can still be, use the language that has been reinforced in our minds over and over and over again when we talk about these issues. So thank you so much for calling that out and for correcting the record on that. So if the answer isn't electoralism, I hear people talk about, say, for instance, denying Israel the foreign aid that we provide to them, in that being a path forward for exercising our influence over this situation. Again, I about that language, I understand, but so in that case, do you feel like that is, if what you said is true and there is really no way to lobby our politicians because they've already been lobbied by much more financially better off and more well off folks than us that can afford to lobby them in this way, what is it that sort of everyday ordinary people can do to support this, to fight against and be in solidarity with the Palestinian people? How do you have any idea of the ways that we can do that?
So right now, as there's a big shift in public opinion, a lot of the news is focusing on the atrocities committed against Palestinians in occupied Palestine. But you don't see a lot of the same attention given to tangible movements like boycott, divestments, and sanctions, or even funding on the ground groups within Palestine that provide people with necessary healthcare, provide people with necessary shelter after their homes have been destroyed, family members killed, etc. And so I think that our goal within the empire itself is to actively be pushing for a boycott, divestment, and sanctions of Israel. We cannot on one breath be reporting in the news that Israel has killed 200 Palestinians today as if that is normal, and not talk about how for decades Palestinians have been telling us to divest from this project that is Israel. If our US politicians are not going to divert funds away from Israel because it has a vested interest in Israel as a colonizing force on Palestine, we have to do our part and engage actively in boycotts, divestments, and sanctions, engage in educating people on boycotts, divestments, and sanctions, and other ways where we can actually hurt financial capital interests within Israel so that, the occupation of Palestine and resistance to that occupation starts to grow, and that politicians then become responsive to us. And so we don't have money, but we can impact money and affect money negatively.
Thank you. That's a great way to put that. So as far as these actions that Joe Biden has done recently at the UN, the UN Security Council, I believe it was, the Biden administration apparently stepped in and blocked a ceasefire statement from the UN. They were hoping to issue this request to, a proposal to cease fire. And that, that language alone, it sounds like, it's often shrouded in the language of like war, where you have a ceasefire during wars. And so again, with this language, it sounds like there's like this is maybe equivocating in a way to even talk about a ceasefire. But do those actions have any significance? The actions of the US at the UN essentially blocking any sort of peace negotiations, not really peace negotiations, let's say, blocking any sort of ceasefire, statement or anything like that. Is there anything that can be done there, or is that significant in any way?
Okay, so the recent terror enacted on Palestinians by Israel, if I'm remembering correctly, it's because Israel is seeking to expand into a Palestinian neighborhood and move in Israeli settlers into that neighborhood. And so I think that by the U.S.
This is the neighborhood of Sheikh Jarrah, correct?
Yes.
Yeah.
By the U.S. Being opposed to any sort of ceasefire, to me, just says that, again, they support that sort of expansion that will be happening in occupied Palestine. But even before that, you had where it was in February or March, the Biden administration and Kamala Harris made it very clear that they didn't support the International Criminal Court investigating war crimes committed by Israel against Palestinians. And again, all of these things, so not agreeing to any sort of ceasefire, so legitimizing Israel's expansion in occupied Palestine, and also not agreeing for the International Criminal Court to investigate war crimes committed against Palestinians by Israel. All of those things sort of legitimize the occupation of Palestine, and also, again, reaffirms U.S. imperial narratives that Palestinians aren't even humans to be considered in any of the equation for expansion in the region.
Okay, yeah, thank you. So for the, is there any sort of parallels between what's happening in Gaza, in Jerusalem right now? Is there any parallels that we can draw between that and sort of what's going on with the policing in the United States? Is there any connection between those two things?
Yeah. So I'm about to give a very long answer, mostly because I want to tie everything together with what I'm saying. So for me and my work, I view imperialism generally as an economic, social, and political system that grants political maneuverability for, states of the global north or Western world that, helps their capital accumulation, that helps the policy choices they can make. And all of this is done at the expense of the people, land, the environment, and the political maneuverability of choices, policy choices that states in the global south can make. And so in the present, you have it where a lot of people talk about, we live in a neoliberal world of neoliberal capitalism. And a lot of the focus on neoliberalism is then pushed to talk about privatization under neoliberal capital. But what isn't sort of spoken about is how the benefits accrued under this imperial system for the global north or Western world, how it sort of impacts those in the global south. And so under neoliberal capitalism, what you have is that you don't have economies that are growing. Any growth that is generated is done through debt. So you have a lot of consumers who go into debt because in the global north, you have stagnant worker wages. And then in the global south, you have wages that were already low. And then as a neoliberal political system, what you have are that there are different choices that states in the global north can make, whether it's, people needing a bit more social welfare or a bit more, healthcare, as you would say. But those same policy choices aren't extended to states in the global south, whereas any sort of nationalizations or social democratic governments are automatically opposed, overthrown, or cooed on in those states. And then you also have the social aspect of neoliberalism, which sort of isolates people and individualizes our problems. So it says that people are poor not because the state is unwilling to challenge finance, capital, or intervene to institute specific sort of welfare problems, but because of their own moral failings. Or you have these problems to blame on your sole individual governments versus the fact that your government may be operating under a system of imperialism, which drastically limits its the political choices that it can make. And so when you have all of this together, what you see is that U.S. imperialism or imperialism in general seeks to integrate countries of the global south within a preferred political, ideological, and social system that, again, benefits people in the global north at the expense of people in the global South. And because these connections aren't made, one of my biggest gripes is then that you have people in countries like the US who push, oh, all we need is more social welfarism, to be more like Scandinavian democratic countries, ignoring the fact that the reason why you have better redistribution in certain global North states is precisely due to because of the exploitation that we see enacted on global South countries who don't have the same options to say, oh, we'd like to be socially democratic states, which again threatens global North capital and financial interests within their own states. And so what you have is then, will people blame themselves or their own states, or will they actually recognize that it is imperialism or capitalism that are leading to these negative outcomes that they may be experiencing? And, you know, I don't consider myself, you know, dumb, or anyone on the watching or any of the hosts on the show dumb, but we recognize that, you know, the system is structured in a way to see us fail. So then, as all empires before, how do you respond to people who know that the system isn't working for them? Well, when you look at from the time of states' independence in the 60s and 70s in the global South, you see global North and Western states actually funding militarization in those countries and heavily funding police forces, because in global South countries, they had to be over-policed, and their states had to be militarized so that people could be repressed from sort of fighting back against what was then seen as, you know, economic interdependence from the Western perspective, but to them was seen as a sort of new type of neo-colonialism. And then today, what you have is that you have, I don't necessarily want to say contraction, but we've reached, you know, further along in this sort of process where challenges to the system then requires a militarized response. And so when people say things like from Gaza to Ferguson, or from Colombia to Bolivia, or any of these other variations, they're just talking about how the structure of our system, which is an imperial system, necessitates at some point militarized violence to be enacted against people that sort of reject the conditions that impact them negatively because of how the system itself is structured. And so I think now when we talk about global police violence, the reason why we can talk about it being global is because you had police violence that was over-enacted in the global South and is now being over-enacted in the global North. And that's why you have a lot of these police forces being trained, you know, between the US and occupied Palestine, or between Canada and Haiti. And it's because all of this is to necessitate, you know, capitalism, which again is not only crisis prone, but pushes sort of these uneven equalities within states and also between states that people are rightfully frustrated about. And to target that frustration, you need a militarized response. Otherwise, you'll see people rising up to protest, as you see in, you know, happening in Colombia right now, or in Haiti.
Thank you for that. That was a wonderful. I appreciate that long answer. That was yes. And so it sounds like, you know, you've hit a lot of important points there. I think it sounds like, you know, one of the things you're saying is that within the state, for us folks that are within we exist within the U.S. empire, it sounds like it is beneficial even to some of the marginalized groups within the U.S. empire. It seems it is still, we in fact do benefit from U.S. imperialism, and in that we are essentially doing, it feels to me like we're doing what we are accusing, you know, in some ways, you know, within our nation here, it seems like we're doing to the Palestinians in some ways what you know, we accuse poor white people of doing to you know, poor black people, essentially, in that they are, you know, we say, well, you have a certain privilege, you know, you have this certain privilege, and because you benefit from this thing, you don't speak out on it. You don't do anything about these issues. You don't talk about these issues because you stand to benefit from this. And it seems like in the same way, we also stand to benefit in some ways. And so that may drive some of this, the silence on coming from, even marginalized groups and folks that you would think would have a level of solidarity and understanding. I mean, you see some of these things happening to the Palestinians, and it's very reminiscent of things that, the Ku Klux Klan, there's mobs, there's lynch mobs, Israeli lynch mobs going into Gazan, cities and in neighborhoods and, dragging people out of their homes, burning their businesses to the ground. This definitely invokes memories, things like the Tulsa massacre and other things when you saw people trying to just exist essentially. So I think that this actually kind of connects to something else that's been going on there. And and something else. So I guess my point there just being that it seems like we need to, in order to be consistent, we should be paying attention to these things in the same way, because we say, listen, you're impacting. This isn't just going to hurt you ultimately. This isn't just going to hurt Black people ultimately. Eventually, it comes back around to you. Where like for things like the crack epidemic in the 80s, we now see there's a opioid epidemic now in the United States, and I often will use the point to say, well, Black folks seem to be a bit of a canary in the coal mine, where these things may hit us first, but eventually they're going to hit you too. So in the same way that we see the militarization ramping up around the world due to the U.S. empire, our funding, our support, our actual provision of weaponry, it seems like we need to make this same case to folks to say, what's going on there, sadly, because it feels like you have to make the selfish argument to some people to say this is going to impact you. You would hope that just the morality of it alone would encourage people to say, well, this is wrong, and we should fight against this because it's wrong. If that argument doesn't work, it seems that there's an argument there that you should do it even out of a self-interest, because what's happening to them, it might be happening over there in the global south right now, but those things will eventually propagate up into the global north in the same way that the sort of, militarization of policing it stands that these sort of actions could take place even in the United States. Is that an okay analysis of that? Does that seem?
I mean, I think it's an okay analysis, but I don't believe that it's always intentional. So I think that in the US, you have it where, because we are in the heart of empire, the propaganda the empire does is also very, very, very effective. Now, I've always been someone who's a tiny bit more critical, or lended myself towards more critical inclinations. And it's because my family are, immigrants to the United States. And so I remember one time I was in middle school and I was in my history class, and, they were teaching us about the tyrants of history. And they, spoke about Hitler. Right after Hitler, they moved on to Mao. And then after Mao, and again, I didn't know too much about Hitler or Mao. Right after Mao, they moved on to Castro. And when they moved on to Castro, I was shocked that he would be included in a tyrant of history, because, in Guyana, for instance, we get a lot of Cuban doctors who come there to help people. And so I was confused as to why they would include Castro as a tyrant. And by simply asking, why is Castro there, I got kicked out of the classroom. And the teacher didn't even answer the question. Like, they interpreted it negatively, or, maybe I was being snarky or whatever. But I got kicked out of the classroom for asking, why is he there? What has he done? Who has he killed? In the same vein that you would include him in a category with Hitler, for instance. And so I was always a bit more critical of those narratives, because what I was being taught at home never really matched what I was being taught in the education system. And as I got older, this showed itself in the fact that, my family lives in the US, and, we're poor, we're low income. And that has been the case for my entire existence here. But something that I will say is that if I wanted to go to the store and buy a can of soda, for instance, it would be relatively cheap for me to do that here. So a couple years ago, when I was in Guyana, a can of soda, and mind you, in Guyana, people make a lot less. I would say that one of my great aunts there, she maybe makes 30 USD a month. But a can of Coca-Cola soda at that time, when I had visited a few years ago, was $5 US. So
that's like over 15% of your monthly pay for a single can of soda, essentially.
So her entire monthly living was basically the equivalent of 6 cans of soda in Guyana. And I remember thinking, like, that's not right, and it makes no sense. How could this be the case? And she is a doctor. And from that, I started really examining how uneven relations are between the Western world and third world countries, just on the basis of when we look at food. Food is one of the most basic ways that people in the global north benefit from imperialism. We don't produce much of the world's food. Europe and the US, we don't have much of the arable land. And yet in countries that do, you have people that are food insecure, malnourished, and sometimes they have famines even though they produce enough food. But they're producing enough food for redistribution back to the global north so that we could go to the store and afford 30 cans of soda at $1, when that's all that someone in a country like Guyana would probably make in a month. And so I think that even at the most basic level, when you talk about food, we can see the ways in which people in the West benefit from imperialism, also in a way that people start to understand more. So every time I talk about the ways that we benefit from imperialism, when I was teaching students, I would always use the instance of food, because something more super basic that we all need to live becomes unaffordable for people in countries that are actually producing the food that we're going to consume.
Wow.
Yeah.
And so I think that making these connections more broadly, or more plainly like that, is necessary. But I think in the US, it's hard to break propaganda because, one, not a lot of people in the US can necessarily afford to travel or go abroad, or two, have the connections to do so. And so to me, the reason why there isn't this sort of strong anti-imperial perspective in the US, for instance, is because not a lot of people are traveling. And what that essentially means is there are not a lot of people in the US that have networks or connections to people in global South countries where these connections between our struggles can be made, or these connections between why we shouldn't be aspiring to Scandinavian democracies is held up as like the gold standard for us. Because those same Scandinavian democracies are also shipping arms to other countries, even though they don't have their own militaries or they have nicer police forces. And those same Scandinavian countries are also benefiting from the same cheap food prices that all global North countries benefit from in the global imperialist system.
Thank you. So on the to your point about the food in a way, I hope that this makes sense, linking this way. But you said that these countries, other countries that are where food prices are much more exorbitant and just out of reach for the everyday people, those are the places where food is actually being produced. I lived in a place like this. I lived in Jamaica. I mean, they export a ton of sugarcane, and they heavily rely on sort of U.S. purchasers and buyers there. And so in this way, for policies like, for instance, a universal basic income that we hear folks talking about like nowadays, do policies like that do you support things like a universal basic income? And is it an issue that we are thinking about those types of policies for ourselves here already before we think about the way that we're going to make things more evenly distributed globally and not just at a national level, but to because if there's a set of people that are producing all the food, but they're having to turn around and pay all these exorbitant prices for it, and yet we're the ones collecting a universal basic income while they're still left struggling. Is that something? Are those kinds of policies that we should get behind, things like a universal basic income in lieu of that, where we're not even the ones producing the food at this point? Should we be focused on other things in about correcting that sort of imbalance and that inequality globally before we necessarily just look inward? Are policies like universal basic income too nationalist, and do you actually support something like a universal basic income?
So if there is a universal basic income in the United States, I think that what will be important is where it comes from. So a lot of the times that you hear people championing universal basic income, what they're championing is we get a universal income by increasing taxes on the rich and the wealthy. But the rich and the wealthy should be paying taxes, but by increasing taxes, you're then saying that how we fund sort of global militarization still remains intact while we keep our universal basic income. Then you have some people saying like, oh, we should limit our military spending a little bit. And those people then, the logical conclusion to that is that they then still support some funding of militarization abroad. And we have so many military bases abroad. And so my problem is not necessarily the fact that there is a universal basic income, but it's with how limited we think about funding certain programs for ourselves. When we think about progressive policies and progressive legislation, my main goal is for it to always be one, of course, taxing the rich, but two, seeing a divestment from the sort of militarized global security state that we not only have in the US and that we not only push abroad, but that we build up in other countries. And because you mentioned that, I just also want to mention, it is not the case that third world countries don't also see the benefits and policies like universal basic income or even social democracies like Scandinavian countries. But it is the fact that because the benefits that we receive here, that we could even talk about redistributing wealth so that we could have a universal basic income, are denied to people in the global south based on exploitation from the West. The most obvious example, because it is one of the most brutal, most recent, and also was a case study, is when we look at the overthrow of Allende in Chile. He was overthrown because he wanted to institute social democratic policies in Chile. If there was a government who wanted to support social democratic policies in the US, leftists in the US will 100% get behind him, and we have that opportunity to get behind him, and we have the opportunity to say, we want these social democratic policies. But because our social democratic policies would rely on the exploitation of those in the global south, whether it's through militarization or through buying up all the land there and damaging their environment so that we could have cheaper food prices here, people in some of these global south countries cannot advocate to have the same social democratic policies within their own states without being perceived as a threat by the Western world, because again, then that would mean that we would be unable to exploit them as much as we would want to exploit them. And so they get overthrown, and then we support, people like Pinochet and other capitalist dictators who will sort of facilitate their own states' exploitation for the benefit of global North and Western states' interests. And so it's not so much that I would oppose something like UBI, it would just to be thinking about how are we getting this? And if it's only through taxes on the wealthy, what does that say about how we view sort of the foreign policies that we enact that are more money intensive because of how violent they are in supporting exploitation abroad?
That's awesome. Yeah, that's so great. So essentially, it sounds like you're saying, it's similar to what we're talking about in the, and I hate to I don't mean to keep on like centering the United States in this, but this is the way a lot of folks think, and sadly myself still in too many ways. But it seems like it sounds similar to what we're talking about when we talk about defund the police, right? It sounds like what we need to be doing and thinking about is how do we defund the military in the same way, where we're saying it's not just about, taking that money away, but it's about where we move that money to as well. And defund the police, we often tie it to, it's not just about taking money away from police, it's about taking the money away from the policing and rerouting that towards systemic root causes of the problem. And it sounds like we should be thinking the same way about our military globally in trying to defund our military and use that funding in ways that actually take into consideration the humanity and the Cornel West often says that every life, an American baby has just as much value and importance, should have just as much love, respect, dignity as a Palestinian baby or a Chilean baby or a Scandinavian, Norwegian baby. And so if we actually are thinking that way and we do believe that, and we say that that's supposed to be our position as a socialist. I believe in internationalist, sort of a cosmopolitan approach to our policy. Is that something that you feel like is missing from the discourse right now? That discussion of defunding our military in that way. It seems like even Democrats, it's like every year the military budget just goes up and up and up. Even under Trump, they were Democrats voted, folks like right here in my home state, Elizabeth Warren, we have Raytheon, you know, they are a major contractor, weapons contractor for the military, for the, you know, military industrial complex essentially. And you have folks like that are seen as progressives even, who still vote in favor. I think like only Bernie is like one of the few people I can think of, that Bernie Sanders, that doesn't vote in favor of all these budgets all the time. But you had folks under Trump still voting not just to approve of Trump's budget, but in fact to give him more than he had even asked. They once, at one point, I think it was 2017 or 2018, they gave him almost $50 billion more than he had even asked for. So is there things that we can be doing as, you know, citizens of an empire like this? What can we do, you know, to help, you know, in that fight, as far as pushing for that defunding of our military, and should that be a bigger part of our discourse?
So I like that you know, were honest, and you sort of mentioned U.S. selfishness, but to the extent that I've seen people talking about defunding the military, and in people I also include Bernie Sanders in this, it's like we're spending X amount of money on our military when we could be using that money to invest in our healthcare. It's again very U.S. nationalistic and U.S. centric, because our military actually facilitates imperialism around the globe. And so when we defund the military, shouldn't we be giving reparations to states that have been brutalized by our military? That would be a perfect example. So this is what I mean by, you have within, you know, progressives or sort of leftists in the United States, they rarely think within this international framework. It's very, you know, selfish, and it's also very nationalistic, which I always find a bit odd, because internationalism and solidarity is the way to go. You cannot defeat a global system of capitalism domestically. It would have to be a sort of international project. So in order to do that, you do need international alliances. You do need international solidarity. Otherwise, what you have is this focus on the national, that then any other, you know, global north or capitalist country can sort of come up and become the next leader of that system, just like the transition from Britain to the US. And so to the extent that I've seen people talking about defunding the military or even diverting military funds away from the military, it's always been to help people within the United States, or to have very US-centric goals, but there's never any sort of reparations for the people that the US military have actively enacted harm against. And this to me is especially odd in light of the fact that we cannot talk about diverting military funds to helping people here when we just, you know, have incessantly bombed countries like Iraq, have incessantly bombed countries like Afghanistan, are currently supporting the occupation of Palestine, actively are supporting genocide, humanitarian crisis in Yemen. And all of these things are related to how our military is exercised abroad. So to see people in the US left not even talk about how military funds need to be diverted in building up these places that you know, the military has actually destroyed, is also something that I sometimes find a bit frustrating.
Yeah, I think I find that frustrating as well. One of the points that I've seen play out a lot on the left is this idea of like protectionism, even on the left. They often talk about it in terms of in regards to trade policies. They often have sort of a tendency towards this nationalist, protectionist rhetoric of, you know, well, let's, you know, why are we spending all this money? Essentially, the root of their anti-war nature is really only in the regards to, we could be spending that money here at home on us, essentially, and not necessarily thinking about how, you know, how the impact that that money has had around the world. We've essentially, you know, spent trillions destroying all of these places, and it seems like it's inconsistent for a leftist to then turn around and say the same, same leftists that are talking about, some at least that talk about we should give reparations, for things like slavery, and we've done reparations in the past. For some groups, it would seem like we should also have, it would be inconsistent of us to not look to the destruction that we've caused and wreaked all over the world and say that the U.S. should be responsible for repairing some of, all of what they've done, really. And so I've noticed that sort of thread as well, in that ideology kind of seeping through on the left, where there are, even folks, I think that, some folks, left-wing commentators and analysts, folks like Kyle Kulinski, who we're going to reference in a second here, have been, and those are people that I followed on the left for a long time and had some respect for, and they still tout this sort of nationalist, in a way, trade policies, and I see a similar thing playing out with our military as well, where it's the idea is, and even I think that unions in some ways are guilty of this in the United States as well, of having too much of a nationalist approach to things like trade policy, where we essentially see some unions supporting things like the trade war with China and the idea of like adding tariffs to these other countries, instead of focusing more on an international working class solidarity. It's more so about just focusing on the, how do we improve, how do we make things better for Americans, and not necessarily looking at, how do we make things fair for workers everywhere. And so that seems inconsistent on the left. It doesn't seem like a proper left-wing position. And so I totally agree with you in that sense.
It also seems ineffective, because based on something that you just said that kind of occurs to me, you'd mentioned about how we cannot really defeat this if we're only trying to attack it ourselves domestically. It's going to take something that will address it. Otherwise, like you said, it could shift to another power. There are other things that it could play to. So it would actually help us more to attack it at a more international level and not just looking out for ourselves in the long run. It would selfishly, even if that's how we have to position it to people, it will benefit us to unify to do it, because we're not going to be able to beat an imperialist or capitalist structure like this without it being kind of a worldwide dynamic. And I feel like that's an interesting point that I just never kind of connected the dot on.
Yeah. So we're already at an hour, and I really want to. Can you stick around a little while longer? And because I haven't even touched on a few other topics. Would you mind sticking around a little bit longer with us, Tamanisha, just to talk about a couple? Okay, I'm so sorry. I'll let you go very soon, I promise. I just wanted to pull up. There was something that you recently talked about that I think connects to this, and I just wanted to talk about that. So let me just pull up one of it's a thread that you did on Twitter, and you said this was from earlier this month. And you said, since I mentioned this in DM, someone had with me my take on the CIA, and this is in regards to the CIA recruitment ad that has been recently released. It was an ad featuring there was a Latina woman in there who talked about how she was intersectionality, that she was a cisgendered Latina woman with anxiety disorders. And so you responded to that and said, my take on the CIA recruitment video and the ensuing contrarian / anti-woke / anti-identity politics backlash against it by some on the left, who again never actually engaged with any of these theories, is this. Because those who consider themselves US leftists lack a clear understanding of imperialism, they fall into the aforementioned traps, which are never to interrogate to whose benefit or why do these institutions feel the need to put out said videos. Hence, much of their attack, trivial at best, focuses on a symptom of a broader problems versus the root. So they, just like conservatives, end up arguing against and about semantics, characteristics, versus the actual reason of why the video should be criticized. I have yet to see a contrarian, anti-woke, or identity politics take that addresses declining enrollment and recruitment into U.S. policing institutions like the CIA, FBI, and military, hence their express need to paint their institutions as inclusive, or a take which points out that while the CIA is an imperialist, violent institution that kills other Latina, anxiety-ridden women abroad, they're able to recruit someone, a part of that demographic within the empire, because here people benefit from imperialism. So I think that connects to what you were talking about earlier, as far as sort of the benefits that we gain here domestically. That is essentially discarded and ignored by a large segment of the left. And what we've heard, in this idea of like this anti-woke rhetoric, I've seen it a lot. It's very pervasive to me on the left, particularly with white leftists. It's predominantly white male, cis white male leftists who have this sort of take typically, but even just white leftists in general, that are quick to jump on the idea. They say they talk about how it is essentially what they're saying is, well, these ideas have been co-opted by liberals, and liberals only want to talk about this shallow, superficial identity politics, and they sort of diminish those terms: identity politics, intersectionality. In fact, we had, there was a prominent leftist, Kyle Kulinski, who said that, intersectionality, essentially no real person that's working a 9-to-5 is using a term like intersectionality, and he completely dismisses the idea of it. He got some pushback for it, but ultimately I didn't see anyone making the case about that I see you making in even in another thread that you did, and you can talk about that here maybe. What is sort of going on here with this, and what is your pushback to this sort of rush to take the sort of superficial, easy tack of saying, oh, it's just weaponized identity politics. The liberals are doing it just to screw with you. So therefore, we should ignore these ideas like intersectionality and identity politics. We should dismiss those like conservatives do with their anti-SJW rhetoric, essentially. To those who say we should dismiss those ideas because they're being co-opted by liberals, what is your response to something like that?
So my response, so obviously in the beginning I was speaking about how, heartened I was to see that there is even more expressed support, at least in social media, on public opinion, for the Palestinian cause. But another take that I saw alongside that was someone saying, oh, it's now woke to support Palestinians. And so I don't know if you can see the problem with this, but my issue with sort of the anti-contrarians or like the anti-woke, anti-identity politics left, outside of the fact that I don't necessarily consider them a part of the left, is that empires have always incorporated the groups that they oppressed, not only into their imperial system, but also within their security apparatuses. There were people from the Caribbean colonies, for instance, fought under the British flag in World War I and in World War II. Was the British Empire then woke for conscripting, people who look like me and my ancestors into their army to fight their imperial wars? The answer is obviously no. Imperial systems under empires, they also sometimes set up fake quasi-legal democratic institutions so that those that they're oppressing can feel as if they have some sort of say. Sometimes to the extent that they even let in opposition within their own democratic institutions to, one, legitimize themselves and also make people feel as if, well, we can work within this system. Hint, hint, we have the squad today that, again, follows this trend. And so when I say that one of the worst things about the US left is this lack of understanding of imperialism and empire, is that then they don't make connections for these tricks. First of all, the CIA has been making inclusion videos ever since the civil rights movement, because why? Fundamentally, what they're looking for are bodies. They're also looking for people who belong to different diasporas that can speak the language, can be perceived as legitimate to people for when they go and topple these governments, for when they go and try to push their specific imperial interests within these countries. And so the fact that the CIA released a video about their inclusivity with a Latina woman was not surprising to me. So I was actually surprised that it blew up against this sort of anti-IDPOL left, because I was like, this precedent has been set for centuries. It is not something new. And so we wouldn't refer to the British Empire as woke colonialism. We wouldn't refer to the British Empire as woke empire. So when you see people saying woke CIA, which is essentially the same thing, you can see how it's contradictory and, honestly, just quite stupid, for lack of a better word. And that sort of framing as, these violent institutions as woke because they necessarily include representative bodies of a specific race or gender or mental disorder, they fundamentally don't understand how propaganda can extend to oppressed groups, where you have some people who are, you know, Black, trans, poor, white, who join these bodies and these institutions believing like, oh, I'm saving or I'm helping people who are just like me. Because one, in the global north, heavy propaganda exists so that we sort of don't make these imperial connections. And two, you also have it where some people are joining these institutions for the simple fact that they are poor. For the large part, when I was growing up, I had a brother and a sister, because my mom's, you know, with her and my dad, it's me, my brother, and my sister. And then when my mom went and got married again and she had 2 kids, they were girls. And something that struck out to me in high school, because my brother was only 1 year under me, was that we had recruitment from the army coming into our schools telling us to join. And if you didn't sign a form to sort of opt out, then you sort of, it was mandatory that you know, got these messages and you got these recruitment calls, etc. And I guess that my brother, you know, just how he is, he forgot to sign the form, but they started sending these recruitment things. And my mom actually went up to our school to tell them, like, this is my only son and he's not fighting for this country. And so how they presented it was that this could be a way out, because otherwise you're not going to go to college. You're probably going to end up in prison and be poor your entire life. And so now we have this unique situation where there's COVID. A lot of schools are closed. A lot of low-income schools are especially closed because they didn't receive all of those COVID resources to have the plastic walls around the desk, to have the socially distanced teaching in places where it's cold, like Wisconsin. They didn't have functioning heater or heating. And so now you have a lot of low-income children that are not going in schools and being recruited by the army. But because army recruitment, you know, relies on poor people of color, on poor white people to increase their numbers by offering it recruitment into the army as sort of this way out, of course, they're going to send out inclusion videos like that one. And they also sent out a series of inclusion videos, not that dissimilar from the series that they set out during the civil rights movement either. And so a lot of the outblown anti-woke reaction is a response to culturalism. And my whole thing is, just because you perceive something, which again is weird to say because you're a leftist, as being social justice that was co-opted by liberals, doesn't now mean that you don't support it. Our job as leftists are to inform the public, to help educate people on what is going on. So our job is not to say, oh, this is why we can't talk about women and intersectionality and representation. Our job is to point out that this is a common tactic of empire to fuel its recruitment drive into its armies to carry out its missions both at home and also abroad. It is not to say, oh, being a Latina with anxiety disorder is now too woke, so this is why we shouldn't try to have Black people or Latina people or poor people in the, you know, these sorts of positions of power. It's no, the institution itself is illegitimate, and the institution itself has always relied on incorporating oppressed groups to legitimize itself, and also to overcome language barriers that it's always had, because it was fundamentally created to oppress a specific group of people. And I think that a lot of that is missed in the US left, because there's this sort of cultural pushback by both conservatives and those on the left who don't see value in sort of oppressed or marginalized identities being front and center of anything. Because I'm 100% sure that if the recruitment ad went viral and it was just a regular white guy, it would have been clowned on as a meme.
Yeah.
As it rightfully would be, you know?
Yeah. And so with that, like with that, to me, it feels like there's this sort of situation going on. And this was something that was brought up, honestly, by a cis white leftist that I don't want to really give any kind of credit to, because he doesn't really deserve it. I don't know if you're familiar with Vosh, but Vosh is, you know, yeah. So I don't want to give him too much credit here. He's got his whole set of problems and a whole set of reasons to criticize him as a leftist. I feel like he is the worst person
We're
to be carrying this message. But in response to this idea, this diminishing, some leftists sort of doing this anti-woke rhetoric and contrarian anti-woke anti-identity politics, he raised the point that it seems like there's a contingent of people on the left that are very quick to use this idea that, okay, well, these terms, these ideas have been there's sort of two sides to it. One, they're not very popular is the one thing that they say. These aren't terms that are used by most people. I'll give a quick example of that just for the sake of this. I'll share this Kyle Kulinski clip. It's a really quick clip here. And after we finish this up, I promise I'll let you go. But let me share this one clip here. And sorry, I have to redo that just so I can get the audio in there. All right. So this is one example.
Intersectional. By the way, no actual person in the real world uses that term unironically. It just doesn't happen. In elitist liberal academic circles, they might talk about this shit, but that's not a normal common person. It's not. There is nobody who's working a 9-to-5 and trying to pay the fucking bills who's also, thinking about intersectionality and being cisgender. That doesn't happen. On top of bringing up intersectionality, she brings up the patriarchy. So now do you see what's going on here? And by the way, this is not going to stop. So this is the CIA's doing it. The FBI is going to do it. The Democratic Party has been doing it for the longest time. I'm not for Medicare for all. I'm not for free college. I'm not for a living wage. I'm not for ending the wars. I'm not for ending the drug war and freeing the nonviolent drug offenders. I'm not for any of the actual policies that are important and would fix the country and make everything better. But I will say the word intersectional.
All right, and he goes on to say, and I will give you my pronouns in my bio. So also kind of making fun of the idea of people using pronouns, and so this is an example. It seems like some on the left are very quick to use that to use those liberal sort of arguments and the liberal framing of these ideas to then dismiss them. But the same folks, and this is what Vaj called out, he said these same folks, it doesn't seem, he doesn't notice that when right-wingers like Tucker Carlson will co-opt ideas like working class, rhetoric. They'll talk about greedy corporations and in co-opt language, sort of class-based language. We don't see those same leftists say, okay, well, these reprehensible people are co-opting this language of class, working class rhetoric. And these folks don't use that to then dismiss those ideas of talking about class issues in the same way that you take the idea, in some of these ideas, things like class consciousness, these are not wildly popular things. These are things that we're still fighting on the left to make people aware of. Does it feel like to you like there's a contingency on the left even, and maybe it's a significant contingency on the left, particularly white leftists, that are very quick to dismiss, use that excuse of like liberal co-optation or co-option to dismiss ideas like intersectionality and gender, gender issues and identity politics in a way that they don't do with things like working class rhetoric when much more abhorrent people are co-opting that, or they're even less popular phrasings. Do you feel like is that something that you noticed? Do you feel like that's going on there?
Yeah, so definitely. So I do want to mention a few things. I think that you have a problem, and I wouldn't say it's a problem with the white left more generally. So every time I talk about leftists and all of these things, even in those threads, I always put in parentheses something to mention, oh, I see this on Twitter. Because, I know white people in real life that are leftists who do not act like a lot of the white people that I see on Twitter. It's almost sort of night and day. And I was someone who, first created a Twitter account because I had to for work and they wanted me to retweet their things. but I didn't necessarily become active on Twitter until like 3 years ago is when I first really started using my Twitter account. But for some reason, you have those who release YouTube videos for or about the left, and those who like post about leftist things online, white leftists, online. For some reason, they view regular people, poor people, homeless people, and just regular non-white people as sort of dumb. And so because they view us that way, their caricature of what the normal person is someone who is dumb. So for instance, he says a normal person wouldn't use intersectionality in their day-to-day life. And that might be true. I'll use my mom as an example. My mom listens to, interviews that I do like this. And my mom also reads everything that I write. My mom also, she never went to college. I'm actually the first person in my family to go to college, to get higher education, all of these things. But my mom reads my work, and she wouldn't necessarily come back and say like, oh, I love what you wrote on imperialism. She'll come back and she'll say, why does the US think that they could go into Haiti and dictate to these people what they must do? So if she can read my academic writing and gauge that, I'm always so perplexed by the fact that they caricaturize regular people as sort of dumb. Like, even myself, because of, my background, there's a lot of times where I'm reading, I see a word I don't know, let me go on Google, let me use my cell phone and look up the word. Like, these are not hard things to do. And so when he says no normal person is using intersectionality, again, I'll use my mom or even my sister as an example. If we go to a park, and this is actually funny, but we were watching my sister in a race. My sister lost the race, but when she lost, there were only 4 other people in the race. One was an Asian girl, and the 3 other ones were 3 white girls. My mom was like, okay, now we're rooting for the Asian girl. That's my mom saying something about representation, because she recognizes that, on some level, at least that person is a person of color. She wants the person of color to win.
Yeah.
And so when they act as if like regular people aren't thinking in these kinds of ways, it's a bit stupid and ludicrous. And also how they frame it like, oh, intersectionality or identity politics gets in the way of sort of our social welfare that we want. It again goes back to this selfishness that we were talking about earlier, as if justice for marginalized groups somehow means that there's a lack of justice for themselves. And so because they always frame things these way, that's why you can have conservatives or even center, Democrats, centrist, moderate, Republicans, whatever, weaponize things like universal healthcare and say, oh, it won't actually help Black people or these other marginalized groups, when we know that that's not the case. And so again, instead of coming out on top of the narrative, they just deride any sort of narratives that includes marginalized people, so that it then becomes detestable to and uncomfortable for marginalized people, who then say, oh, they might be racist because of how they're approaching this topic or issue. And I made a post a few years back on Instagram that spoke about identity politics. But in the post, I wrote about how white identity politics wins out so much that you can have someone like Tucker Carlson talk about the working class and quote unquote mean the white working class. And some leftists stupidly refer to that as, oh, class populism or material populism, without recognizing that it's fascism, because you cannot have right-wing populism. Right-wing populism does not exist. That is just fascism. And so every time I hear people refer, oh, he's using populist ideas or he's using, all of these things, it's like, stop calling Tucker Carlson a populist. He's a fascist, and he's signaling something to his base. And so it's sort of like white identity politics are what's actually winning out, but any sort of gains that could be interpreted as non-white gains are seen as a threat, not just to conservatives, but also to those on the left who want to envision a colorblind society without actually doing the work for that to happen. And so you also see this on the right, where they pretend, oh, racism isn't an issue. Again, envisioning a colorblind society that you did no work for it to actually be that way. And so, again, there's so many parallels between the sort of anti-woke, anti-IBL, anti-contrarian left with actual conservative culture war narratives. And the fact that they don't see that is, ironic, since I'm pretty sure Kyle Kulinski, he also talks about how right-wingers stick to the culture wars, and he's turning around and doing the same exact thing.
Yeah, so ultimately it just feeds into these sort of these culture wars. Looks like a viewer had a question and said, are you saying that we are not supposed to criticize the CIA for using identity as a shield? Did you want to respond to that?
Yeah, of course you're supposed to be criticizing the CIA, just like you should criticize empires of the past who, again, incorporated and included the people that they were actively oppressing into their own armies, and sometimes to carry out their own oppression, the facilitation of oppression of people within their own states. Batista was Cuban. Should we not criticize Batista? Of course we should. But don't stick on the fact that it's the identity. The problem is the institution itself and how the institution is weaponizing that identity, again, to facilitate imperial means. It's not the fact that she's Latina and she's in the video that we should be concerned about. What we should be concerned about is how there's this continuation, this continuing tendency for empire to incorporate people that it actively oppresses into its institution to, one, legitimize itself. And I also think that the fact that she's Latina and there's, you know, a growing Latino population in the US, and also that we have increasing hostilities towards countries in Latin America that speak Spanish, none of that is lost on me. I think that we need to be making these connections, like why that video and why now? And I don't think that those connections are being made.
Yeah. It seems like the work of the left is not in, and this is one of the issues I think I have with the idea of populism sometimes, is like, because my understanding of populism is essentially you are, again, this is as defined much in part by like Kyle Kulinski in my mind, because he's somebody that I watched for a long time. When he says he's a populist, and his idea of populism is that you know, poll the country. He says he's a constitutional populist. He believes we should have a constitution, but then we should take whatever issues are popular to the majority of people in the country and focus on those issues and whatever's popular amongst the country. But it seems like throughout history, there's been a lot of things that would be considered unpopular, you know, things like freeing the slaves or, you know.
I do want to note that, again, and this, again, going back to something I said earlier, you cannot have populism without education. And so I would say that video of Kyle Kulinski deriding sort of intersectionality and patriarchy talk or whatever is actually misinforming his audience for the function of a CIA video like that. Like abolishing slavery was not popular. You had to educate people on why slave abolition was necessary. You had to get people on your side. And so populism is never, these ideas are popular and we must enact them. Populism is that we have educated people about these ideas, because you can also say, for instance, under Israeli occupation, populism is genociding Palestinians. And I don't think any person on the left would agree that then that is where we must go. And how is that the popular narrative? Because of expulsions, displacements, increasing number of Palestinian refugees that came about due to Israeli occupation, that you have seen that now there are more you know, Jewish people in the region, in the occupied territory, than there are Palestinians. Like, so that is why I said that there is no such thing as right populism. There's only fascism, and then there's educating people about how the system works, and then people actually come to those conclusions by themselves. Even if they're not using the term identity politics, intersectionality, or patriarchy, women, for instance, know that their labor is being undervalued, or that they're working hard in the home. People know these things, even if they're not using academic jargon for it. And so I think that you have, again, this hyper focus on culture and academic language, which negates the fact that people are not dumb. If you talk to people plainly, they understand these things.
Yeah. I wholeheartedly agree. I think that's the work of the left, is to, you know, if we're principled, holding a principle means holding that principle even if it is not popular, and fighting for it until it is. And so I think that it almost, to me, it just feels like it's always coming at the expense of like Black and brown and marginalized people when they say, well, it's not popular. Well, we're marginalized. We're not the majority. We're minorities. We're not the majority. It will never be popular. You know, things like reparations for Black people. Not that, you know, and that's a complex topic, I understand. But things like that will never be seen as popular. Things like affirmative action won't really be a popular idea. But I don't think that necessarily means that we shouldn't fight for things that only affect a small group within us. If that group is being disadvantaged and we are leftists and we want to correct injustices, it would seem that part of our work is in educating people and,
Yes.
and to spread the word, to make sure that we fight for these things in, you know, in the face of all of the, you know, the sort of contrarianism and you know, sort of conservative pile on to terms like these. It's our job to then, and a lot of these people are the same people that look at Bernie Sanders and like will admire Bernie Sanders, like literally like Kyle Kulinski is somebody that looks at Bernie Sanders, and I don't mean to pile on like Kyle Kulinski here, but like he's somebody that talked about his affinity for Bernie Sanders because of Bernie's consistency on policy issues dating back 30, sometimes 40 years, when these positions were wildly unpopular. Things like, you know, or just not, you know, not there wasn't a lot of awareness of things like a single payer healthcare system, or a, you know, increasing the minimum wage, and things that just simply were not popular at the time. People look back now and they use that and admire him for those things, but then those same people are standing here in this moment and not recognizing that they are, you know, relative to Bernie Sanders back then, they're not standing up in the same way that, you know, in fighting in the same way that he was, even though they seem to admire that quality, his consistency, his principled stances. It seems like some on the left are resigned to just simply go with whatever seems to be the main, you know, the popular narrative, and we're sort of working from our starting from our back foot and having to be defensive immediately instead of taking the offensive on these issues. Yes. And actually, you know, pushing our own narrative. We're just sort of succumbing to the liberal and conservative narratives. And you mentioned this, and I got to let you go soon because it's been an hour and a half, and I don't want to steal any more of your time here. But you know, you had mentioned before the sort of way that this has been also used to diminish some of the sort of Black liberation work. Things like identity politics, that's a term that really was started by a collective of queer Black women, the Combahee River Collective, and these, and you know, Martin Luther King
who actually rejected Black bourgeois feminism, but that does not get talked about because they want to only talk about identity politics because they've ceded to the liberal narrative that it simply means representation. If the creators of identity politics only wanted representation, they wouldn't have had a problem with the Black bourgeois national, you know, Black feminism agency, but they did.
Absolutely. And so with that, like, you know, do you, with these things, they seem to have done similar things with Martin Luther King. They when they talk about him, they sort of have accepted the liberal sort of framing of folks like Martin Luther King, and as a sort of, you know, just the sort of vote nice and nonviolent, you know, peaceful protests, but ignoring some of the socialist ideals that he held. Do you consider yourself a socialist?
I do.
Or is that a label? You do? Yeah. What is your?
I do.
What is
like,
your
I don't go around and I say, oh, I'm, you know, Tamanisha and I'm a socialist. I just feel as if I'm someone who, like, I honestly do wish that there could be better in the world and for the world, and not just in the US, but everywhere. Yeah.
And do you have, so, you know, I got to let you go, Sue, because I've taken up too much of your time here. I could talk to you. I just want to keep going because you have a fascinating perspective, and I really do appreciate you coming on here and educating all of us. I feel like I'm infinitely smarter than when I started this conversation, having listened to you. And so I would, you know, I don't want to pull, you know, steal any more of your time here, but would you hopefully be interested in coming back on here again and discussing some more of these topics? Because I've got a million other questions that I wanted to ask you. If you have a few more minutes, we can try to take a couple of questions from the audience, but honestly, you've given us so much of your time already. I don't want to take any more from you. So, but hopefully if you don't have the time to spare now, if you have the time in the future, we would love to have you back on to discuss these things. We have, you know, we'd love to talk to you about the, you know, cancel culture and some of the things going on there as well. And then just I think that we really all have to start to do the work, and I need to do the work. I've realized even in this conversation of realizing how often because of things like American exceptionalism, I just center the US too much in the discussion. And I think that, what you are, helping us to better understand here is to have a more internationalist perspective that we claim to, believe in, but don't necessarily do the work of enacting. And so I think that it would be a great service to our audience and just the public in general to have folks like you, your voices amplified as far and wide. I will encourage larger platforms to certainly that I'm connected to try to invite you on if you have the time as well, so that you can educate these folks, because I think that what you're talking about is, I think you have a very unique, like what you're adding to the discourse in a way that I think a lot of people are just sort of picking up and running with what's already there and sort of taking this very superficial, narrow perspective on these things. And I really think that you're thinking about these issues in a way that not many other people are, particularly online. I also spend a lot of my time online, and so I'm in a bit of a bubble, especially under COVID. I think we're all a little bit more online than we would all hope to be. But so just, I just want to thank you again for your time. It's been really, really awesome talking to you and getting a better perspective on the sort of internationalist approach and to better understand the impact of US empire, not just on our daily lives, but on people all over the world. And so just thank you, Tamanisha, for coming on and for talking to us. I really appreciate that.
Thank you so much for having me, and I would not mind being on. I also just want to note that I had my screen in full screen mode, and so I completely missed all of these.
Oh, look.
And so if you guys copy them or something, then I would like to read them and see what people were saying.
Yeah,
okay,
we can
absolutely.
Definitely pop some back up. Absolutely.
Yeah. So we'll definitely, I'll get you that. And but yeah, so thank you so much for your time, and I'll let you go now. To everyone, can you let folks know, where can folks find you, and are you okay encouraging people to follow you on Twitter? Is that okay?
My Twitter name is just my name that you see on the screen, Tamanisha John.
All right, and there's links to Tamanisha's Twitter profile in the description below. I think we also linked to a recent article that she wrote there, and so I think we have all those links in the description box below. Please check out her work and follow folks like Tamanisha, because we for purposes of intersectionality in our in our discourse, and making sure that we're getting voices that aren't just the typical cis, straight, white, male, Protestant, whatever, all that sort of thing. We need more voices, and people need to understand that there's a whole chorus of people out here speaking on these issues. So thank you so much, and I really appreciate you taking the time to join us today. And we hope to have you back on very, very soon to keep the conversation going.
Thank you so much. Bye-bye, everyone.
Thanks, Tamanisha.
Thank you.
All right, so that was Tamanisha John, everyone, Ph.D. candidate in foreign relations, and that was an exceptional conversation. I'm sorry that I overran most of that, so that you didn't get much of a chance to jump in there. Kwame, I apologize. This is our this is our first, I think, live interview that we've done.
Yeah.
So please understand that this is really we're at the beginning stages here. This is a little rugged for now. Bear with us. We'll get better at this as we go. I apologize. I'm not a professional interviewer, but we're learning as we go, folks. All right. So we really appreciate everyone who commented. If we have any comments or questions, I can definitely, I think we got to ask. I asked a few of them from the audience. I got the socialist question in there for Tamanisha and a few others. Are there any other comments, questions that we want to take? The Doctor of Desire says, do you think this conflict will have a ripple effect on neighboring statehoods for a generation or more? That's something that we'll definitely, I'll pass along to Tamanisha to see if she would like to answer that, and maybe we can pass along some of these to her as well, and or just use them as a jumping off point for our next conversation. So. Yeah. Thank you so much to Brian June for the super chat. Really deeply appreciate that. Brian June says, great discussion and panel. Thank you so much for that. I really appreciate that, Brian. Thank you so much for joining us and for checking us out. Really, really appreciate that. So, and really appreciate the support. Can't thank you enough for that. So Tammy said, who are considered settlers and what groups are exempt from that label? For instance, in the US, to what extent should Black Americans, descendants of slaves or refugees or undocumented people be? I think that's a great point, because I often, during that conversation, I said we and us, and, I mean, I think that can somehow, it can sort of homogenize things in a way where maybe not every group within a nation is necessarily a part of the sort of settler class of individuals. But I do think that what Tamanisha was trying to help us understand is that even individuals of marginalized groups can still benefit from that colonialism. And so that's something that we definitely have to look out for. So yeah, I think that it's inherent upon all of us to try to keep those things in mind as we sort of think through these things. AJ Frost, great direction of topic. Thank you, AJ. Shout out to AJ. Appreciate you commenting. Thank you so much. And to anyone who hasn't done so already, please hit the like button down below, subscribe, share this video out. We'll be editing some clips of it and share those edited clips out as well, so that you can, we can share some smaller bite-sized chunks here. Johnny Bravo says, do you think Black Lives Matter would support the CIA ad? If so, do you think that's a problem? I don't think Black Lives Matter is a decentralized organization. Yeah. So you're talking about, essentially, would the mass of people that support Black Lives Matter, the Black Lives Matter movement, support the CIA ad? I would have to say, a resounding no, I'm guessing. No. But we should also recognize that BLM Incorporated, the organizations associated with Black Lives Matter are not decentralized organizations. There are a few. There is the Black Lives Matter Global Network that has had a lot of sort of controversy surrounding it recently. They released 7 demands, the first 4 of which were not targeted at the system whatsoever. They were all
keep Trump off of Twitter,
keep Trump off Twitter, and don't let Trump run for public office ever again. Things that are just authoritarian in nature, also just completely individually targeted, individualistic in their range, and so it doesn't represent the larger organization. So would a group like that, who is hyper focused on the Democratic Party and in support of the Democratic Party and against the Republican Party, would a group like that possibly support this kind of CIA ad? Maybe, honestly, maybe indirectly, not directly, but I think indirectly, yeah, they support initiatives like this, because when you support things like framing Trump as some sort of unique, he being the only part, he being the cause of the cause of the problem and not a symptom of the problem, I think that then that can lead to to things like being co-opted into the Democratic Party, which does uphold the sort of, they are pro law enforcement at this stage. They've really been moved to the right and shifted to the right. So I think that you can ultimately indirectly end up supporting those things when you support these organizations that aren't democratic in nature, like the Black Lives Matter Global Network, and aren't decentralized in nature, and are sort of they're just, or I mean, that same Black Lives Matter Global Network also created a super PAC, which is something that we should not, you can't be putting more money into politics, more dark money into politics, and so getting behind a Democratic Party, I think, is a when you support the Democratic Party, you support U.S. imperialism, because the Democratic Party supports U.S. imperialism. So, yep, we answer that, Marxist-Leninists. And of course, we're socialists here. We believe in workplace democracy. Didn't have time to talk to Tamanisha about that. I sucked with that. I should have cut that. I should have gotten through the topics a little faster. And I'm just, it's hard to get a hang on that stuff. So I apologize for not being able to cover as many topics as we had hoped to, but we'll have Tamanisha back on as soon as we can to finish this discussion for sure. Because yeah.
One thing I did want to share was speaking to the whole Black Lives Matter question. I thought was a little interesting was that she actually had shared a pretty good tweet about the speaking to the co-opting, where she even said we could truly and actually organize
run that whole thread from the read that part out first, but then yeah.
Okay. We could truly and actually organize a mass set of people versus caving into liberal options, because BLM isn't anti-capitalist. BLM focuses too much on race, since fundamentally, at minimum, both BLM, just like the CRM, civil rights movement, call out state carcerality and demand programs that help people. So I think based on that pretense that most likely, speaking at BLM in that facet, probably wouldn't go with the CIA.
Oh, absolutely not. Exactly.
Yeah.
That's where she's saying, and to suggest, otherwise BLM is again this decentralized thing only to the extent that liberals would support the CIA. Would anyone within BLM support the CIA? Because it's not unique. And that's one of the points that Tamanisha really tries to make, is that what's happening isn't unique to Black leftists or Black liberals. These are, it's the same amongst all, even Black, white, and any other liberal or leftist. And so maybe you can maybe we can read through this thread, but she's essentially talking about how we exceptionalize these things when they happen within Black movements. We act as if they're somehow exceptional, somehow it's different. You see this even with the idea of like homophobia, right? Like they try to pin that on Black people as somehow uniquely homophobic, when I'll just say we are just as homophobic and transphobic as everybody else.
They're doing it currently right now with the stopping Asian hate. They're making it seem like we are overwhelmingly the only people that are transgressing, when I think let's just be real. We make up a small portion of this country. So
yeah, and I will say, and to the extent that there has been, and I have looked at, there's been a recent study. It didn't break down the numbers, unfortunately, into specific. They only broke it down by non-white versus white, and so I don't know the exact numbers for Black folks versus anyone else. But there was certainly a disproportionate number of attacks from non-white people against Asians in a way that there isn't for hate crimes against, and this is specifically hate crimes, in a way that there isn't. 99% of hate crimes that were studied in this research study, 99% of hate crimes against Black people were committed by white people. 99%. 75% of the hate crimes against Asian people were committed by white people. The other 25% were committed by non-white people. So to me, that does say that there is something significant there. And to me, what that means is that that's a little bit of what we're seeing going on in Israel right now. And that's happening. And we should still, again, not exceptionalize it, certainly not exceptionalize it, because I don't think it's exceptional to Black people. I simply think that it's all, all other groups that have been marginalized and attacked by white people in the past. We're seeing ourselves now turn around and in some ways fall victim to the same sort of, set of ideas that can lead people to these sort of, to essentially lash out. Oh, well, I was treated this way. I'm glad it's not me. So I want to treat somebody else in this way. And so we should, rightfully so, be able to call that out in the same way that we would for any other group. These are people that are even, poor white folks that, we might say that like, might do these things. It's because they may feel, disempowered by the, by the state and by their government, and feel like they're losing ground and all those sorts of things. And so they then turn around and they take that anger and violence out on the people that they see as lesser than them. And so I think we should look at that and say there is something unique about that, and we should not exceptionalize it, but also not dismiss it either. And
it doesn't get dismissed, but it's not a uniquely us problem the way that they would try to lead it to.
Exactly. And the media has been really like showing a lot of those clips, and it's horrific and it's horrible, and we certainly stand out against it.
Absolutely.
But there is these aren't exceptional things. There is anti-Blackness across the world and across the globe. There is anti-Blackness and colorism, and those things aren't unique to the United States. Black people are discriminated against. Darker skinned people are discriminated against all over the world. And people that aren't even darker skinned are sometimes, as Cornel West says, they are niggerized. It has happened in the past to people like the Jewish who were essentially niggerized and ghettoized. And so they do the same. They're doing the same things that they did to Black people ultimately too.
Not to mention that I've seen people float the idea, when we have such a large so much exports out of America, especially like our culture, our entertainment, that if a lot of other foreign countries consume our entertainment, and our entertainment inherently is anti-Blackness, has anti-Blackness in it, some of that is going to bleed outwards, and that's been for even things like I wish I had thought that I would make this point so I could have had it pulled up. Someone had drew that line with blackface, and how that pops up in foreign countries. Because, you know, our culture exports to so many foreign countries as well.
Yep. Absolutely. So, to this point, Marxist-Leninist says, radical democracy, what is your opinion on Black nationalists trying to have Black people form their own country? In one thing, before I move on, I'm going to answer that question in 1 second, Marxist-Leninist. Before I move on to that, the point that Tamanisha was making here as well, I just want to say, was also that this is then turned around and used to diminish sort of the Black liberation movement and Black people's role in revolutionary thinking. And so it ends up, what that has the effect of is that now in this day, that continues and that pattern continues, and we are, you know, the Black voices of today are being, you know, diminished and looked at as if they're, you know, somehow like, you know, or whitewashed over and dismissed, and we're not recognizing and appreciating the work that was put in this work having already been done by, you know, sort of, Martin Luther King was anti-capitalist, he was a socialist, he was an anti-imperialist, and to act as if, you know, to dismiss things like identity politics and to exceptionalize these things, what it does is it makes people think that it's okay to then sort of ignore the work of Black revolutionaries. And that's how we, even on the left, you don't see people, and I don't see white leftists enough, like, you know, understanding and knowing and referencing folks like Fred Hampton and Martin Luther King. They're more, you know, revolutionary politics. They just sort of accept the liberal definition of these people and keep it moving.
Because at that point, I also wonder, because, you know, once you get to that point where you start mocking things like intersectionality and patriarchy, you know, then does someone who speaks out about those things get an invite onto a show like Secular Talk? You know, if Fred Hampton would have preached intersectionality, would he have gotten an invite to Secular Talk if he was around
Fred
today?
Hampton built the Rainbow Coalition.
Would he be dismissed as you know, just an ID pool pusher?
Yep, absolutely. You know, and you know, to that point, exactly. Like, you know, when they do that, what I noticed in this conversation, one of the things that had frustrated me was just a centering of whiteness in the whole conversation. I saw it from comrades of mine, just a total centering of whiteness. The idea that, well, these things aren't even popular, and like, so we shouldn't be bothering with that. And it's always at the expense of Black and brown people, really, and the most marginalized amongst us. And so, you know, we shouldn't, you know, and can't dismiss those sorts of things. And it's just, to me, what something that pissed me off in this, like, we're having a conversation about intersectionality, and we're like, you know, the key players in this. And I'll be real, when we do this video, I guarantee you, when we edit this video up and chop it up, the parts where we talk about Kyle Kalinske and Bosch, and if we put that in the title, that's going to get tons more views on YouTube than when we talk about just, if we generally broadly put a title of US empire, because people are just more concerned with, oh, well, here's this prominent person that I like. I want to hear about them and read about them, versus actually getting to the root of the issues. And so what ends up happening is, you know, it's like sort of a self-fulfilling prophecy, just like a continuous cycle of like, well, who are those people that we already consider? It's all the implicit biases that have elevated those people in our, you know, in men, you know, white folks, cis folks in the discourse. And then we you know, people focus on those. And so I just feel like there's, you know, this centering of whiteness on issues like this, while we're just totally dismissing something like intersectionality, and not even bringing on a Black leftist or someone like Tamanisha to help you understand these ideas, and why it is incumbent upon us to fight back against that sort of
it's
you know,
wild. It's like you are a chef and you create a dish, and two people are arguing about like the way it tastes and how to make it, and you're sitting right there and no one's consulting you. It's like, y'all didn't even invent this, you know, like you're not an expert on this. Like, Kyle kind of describes intersectionality wrong in that video.
No, he did. Yeah.
So
he described intersectionality as when an issue is affected by a bunch of different things. You know, he said like when something is affected by a bunch of different things, which is really the idea of overdetermination, a Marxist idea, in fact, that's what he was referring to. The idea that, you know, things are impacted by many different things, and so a situation can be overdetermined where you can't really determine what was the one impact. It's not one thing. It's really, you know, the cross section of all of these things happening. But that is not what people mean when they talk about intersectionality, and it shows you how much the term has been bastardized, you know, by and just dismissed to the point and diminished to the point where they don't even do the work of actually trying to engage with these things. As Tamanisha had pointed out, like, these are folks that don't even engage with these ideas, but then turn around and dismiss them. It's just the problem for me, and I think that Vaush, again, somebody who I typically just like, I bore, he actually got it right in this issue. And I saw people that were just like instinctively, because they don't like Vaush and they like Kyle Kulinski, they're framing it in a way as if Vaush is wrong on this, when in fact, credit where credit's due. I don't care who who's saying it. If somebody says something that's correct, I'll say yes, that's the correct position to take. Vaush was correct in this debate I do see in his argument wasn't that Kyle Kulinski doesn't talk about Tucker Carlson or doesn't criticize.
I watched the video and we talked about it, I misinterpreted the argument that Vaush was making. I'd seen a clip of it. You
misinterpreted it.
I misinterpreted because I saw a clip. Yeah, I saw a clip of somebody breaking it down. I misinterpreted it because it seemed, based on how it was covered, like the whole thing was like, he doesn't cover Tucker Carlson, when that wasn't even the point. They buried the lead.
I'll call out my comrades. I love I don't want to do it because I don't want to start it's no left infighting or whatever. But my comrades at the Vanguard, framed it as Kyle Kulinski destroys Vaush's straw man, was like the part of the title of the video. If the analysis I wish they had come to was that, in fact, it was Kyle Kulinski who was strawmanning Vaush in that situation, somehow accusing him of not criticizing Tucker Carlson, when in fact what he said was that when they talk about Tucker Carlson, what they do, they dismiss ideas like intersectionality because they say they've been co-opted, but they don't dismiss ideas about class politics and class consciousness simply because it's been working class rhetoric has been co-opted by faux populists like Josh Hawley or Tucker Carlson. We don't then just dismiss those ideas as, well, those are unpopular, or those are those are being co-opted. They still hold on to that and they fight for those things. Why? Because those things stand to benefit them, and in these other things again, I don't want to harp too much on reparations because I have different ideas about it now, but things like reparations, like they won't take a position on that. They'll insult and laugh at intersectionality and dismiss that, not realizing how unwelcoming they're making the left for Black folks that might otherwise agree with them on a whole lot of policies. But when they see you dismiss them outright, language like that then starts to feel like, okay, well, they don't see me.
Not just dismiss, but like mock, in the way that Kyle did in that video. And again, not to just keep bashing on Kyle, but he's a very prominent figure who did this shit. So we're going to talk about it.
Should we not support things should we not support disabled people? They don't make up a majority. They're a small minority of people in this country. Trans people. Should we not support the humanity rights for those people? Proper policies that look out for these people, just because they're a fringe group. They're a small group within it. It doesn't have to be. It doesn't happen to be popular ideas. If we believe in those things,
you have to support it to normalize it. That's why people put their pronouns in their profile, so we can normalize it and make it a more normal thing, because it does help. It is a healthier thing. And again, to mock things like that is just, it doesn't really it's not warm and cozy. It doesn't make people want to show up and fight in a system that's already grinding us down and overworking us and making us depressed and making it so hard to fight. To drag yourself to the front line of the fight and stand next to someone who just did basically almost a low-key stand-up set clowning you doesn't feel great.
Exactly. And it seems to me like they're much more compassionate towards right-wing,
yes,
white working class right-wingers than they are towards Black and working class left-wingers, people that would be left-wing if you run down the policy with them. But they're much more concerned about pulling those people into their audience. And let me be real, it's because those people are already an audience, essentially. That is already an online audience. A lot of Black folks have disengaged from politics, and you have to do more work to bring those people in. It takes work to bring those people in. And I don't see a lot on the left that are willing to do that work. They simply want to, sort of go with the market, go where the market pushes them. And because it's popular, you get more views on it, you get more clicks, you get more support, you get more subscribers. When you dismiss things like intersectionality and you laugh at it and you diminish it like you do, all the while not realizing that what you're doing is you're diminishing the very people that you claim to be allied with.
Yeah, and even in his response, it got the lead got buried because his response was centered more around like, this is what I've done. I have held Tucker Carlson. I've been critical of him multiple times. He focused way more on that, and then just never really addressed the issue, while still kind of like not exactly doubling up, but kind of still doubling down and kind of just like repeating the same stuff. And it doesn't help. And then he ends up to your point of relating more to right-wing people. He goes on to spend a large point bragging about de-radicalizing people. And something that really sticks with me is something that Bad Empanada had pointed out in a really awesome video that he has done recently, where he was talking about like debate culture and a lot of this culture on the left, and like this de-radicalizing, and how like it's so to what Tamanisha was saying earlier about US centric, like, kudos, you de-radicalize someone who is who was like tiptoeing into the alt-right in a way that, like, yes, I mean, like, that's good, but like that doesn't benefit anyone but the US. And realistically speaking, that's not helping any of the countries that the US is bombing that we're bombing right now, or we're helping to
like kill. That's probably not the most reliable leftist at that point. If somebody was a Nazi just a year ago, like, odds are they got a whole lot more work they're going to need to do to get around. And the idea that like some YouTuber is gonna be the thing that changes their mind enough, I just think that the real work we got to start to do is more community oriented, more targeted towards the disenfranchised folks that already would the people that passively agree with us than the people that actively disagree with us, really, on crucial issues like it's fine when it's like little fringe economic stuff, but when it's like recognizing somebody's full humanity of like trans people or gay people or Black people or indigenous people or Latino people or immigrants or whoever it happens to be, we need to that is not where we cannot compromise on those sort of issues.
Just to keep it a buck, because like on that point of it being popular, like we don't always win when we put up our really good ideas. We lose on votes. Our ideas are, if they're that you want to talk about popularity, we can't pass really popular ideas. So like, does popularity even matter? Are ideas that popular, or do we stand behind them because it's the right thing to do?
Yeah, I just want, we should try to, our focus should be on trying to be on the right side of history on these issues and to fight, I don't want to look back. So let me, Comrade Lenin asked, what is the definition of intersectionality? Are you saying it's separate from Marxism? Yes, the concepts of intersectionality and Marxism are completely separated. Marx did not, didn't concern himself with the idea of intersectionality. Intersectionality is just the idea of the overlapping identities of any individual, the idea that somebody is, and maybe you can better define, maybe you can give a better definition of this. I'm just giving my sort of off the top definition of this, but it's the idea of all the overlapping identities that somebody holds, and the fact that along those different intersections you experience even further it's sort of like a multiplying effect on the oppression that those groups face. So if you're Black, you face one set of oppression. If you're a woman, if you're Black, you face racism. If you're a woman, you face you're oppressed by misogyny and patriarchy. If you're trans, you're oppressed by transphobia. If you're a a black, trans woman, you are impacted along all those intersections, and therefore it sort of compounds the struggle and the suffering that you're made to face. So it's just recognizing that there are overlapping identities within anyone. I mean, it's even if we haven't had language for it. I saw in Democracy Matters, written in 2004 by Cornel West, he mentions James Baldwin being not just black, but also black and gay. He's talking about intersectionality there, just without the language of the terminology. But all terminology does is help us to define ideas and concepts, and we shouldn't push or laugh at or diminish language like that. That's the same kind of language that was like civil rights and things like that, were laughed at or were acted like, oh, that's that's so fringe and silly, and it took people fighting to popularize those ideas. Marxism is simply a critique of capitalism and of economic systems in general, where Marx is focused on the surplus of labor in figuring out what is the importance of the surplus of labor, who controls the surplus of labor in any given economic system, and simply focusing on those issues. So Marxism and intersectionality are two completely separate ideas. What I talked about was overdetermination was a Marxist idea, and that's just the idea that certain situations and events can have many different factors that are affecting them that led to that thing. It's not just that, even with the condition of Black people in America right now, it's not just slavery. It's slavery, it's Jim Crow. It's also U.S. imperialism and things that we were talking about here. And so we just and keep in mind, class is one of the intersections. And I think this gets overlooked way too much, is that when we talk about intersectionality, class is a major point of intersectionality. One of those
if you're saying,
are you a poor Black person versus a wealthy Black person? I feel more connected to a poor, white person in many ways than I do a Oprah or Jay-Z or Beyonce. That's
with that being said, if you can acknowledge that, and if you're pushing class solidarity because you acknowledge that, that you relate more to someone in the same class as you versus a rich Black person, you're talking about the closeness there is because you guys are closer where it intersects, where it comes together. It's almost like it has something to do with I wish there was a word that would convey this point.
Idea. So that's the point on that. I also saw a question about the idea of, Marxist-Leninists said, what is your opinion on Black nationalists trying to have Black people form their own country? And to that, I would encourage, I believe what you're talking about is not Black nationalism, if I'm correct. Listen, I'm not well versed enough in this to speak on it confidently, but my understanding of Black nationalism is not the idea of having a separate country for Black people. It's the recognition of one common identity here, one common a common situation for Black people, all forms of sort of diaspora Black people having a common thread amongst all of them. And so the idea of there being a Black nation amongst nations, not that what you're talking about, I think is actually Black separatism. And that is a separate notion and not what Black nationalists believe. Black nationalists are simply saying, listen, we as capital B Black people share this identity, and we share certain lived experiences simply because of our ethnicity. We wherever we happen to wind up, whether it be in America or Africa or Britain or Asia or South America, Black people have sort of a shared lived experience and a shared ethnicity there. And so it's more of a recognition of that and an attempt to develop solidarity through that recognition, not to try to create a separate ethno-state for Black people. That is not what the movement is about. That is not what I believe. I don't believe any ethno-state is a rational way to proceed. I just simply, I do not agree with that. I think that you end up having the same thing that's happening with what Jewish Israelis are doing to Palestinians right now is the same thing that Black people could be doing to other marginalized groups if we create a Black ethno state. I don't want to see Black people take power. I want to see power dismantled in every way, shape, and form that we can, and have that power returned back to the people through democratic institutions and means. And so that means democracy in the workplace, democracy in our housing, just democratizing our economy, and then hopefully, achieving a true democracy in our political system. Cornel West, in his book Democracy Matters, I know I'm citing that a lot because I'm reading it right now, he says that democracy is a verb, not a noun. It's something that we have to continually work on, and it's an action that we take every single day, not something that's sort of stagnant and stationary. It's something that we're constantly working towards, and we have not achieved that yet in the US or pretty much anywhere else. Comrade Lennon says, I'm a leftist, but in principle, I don't support abolishing prisons. If prisons didn't exist, where would you put corrupt Wall Street bankers and mass shooters and rapists? We're going to have on next week, hopefully on Wednesday, we're going to have Awkward on the show. He's in fact, he's Jewish Palestinian, rapper, activist, abolitionist, he fights for prison and police abolition. We're going to have him on for a discussion on this. I think it's going to be a really great discussion. So definitely look out for that. The quick answer to that from the abolitionist perspective is, one, you talk about, well, you're specifically asking abolishing prisons. What do you do with the, for instance, let's just be specific for the few things. For one, you say, what do we do with the rapists? Well, we can't ignore the fact that there are, you hear this a lot. The question that will come up to abolitionists is like, well, what do we do with the murderers and the rapists, right? Well, one, we should acknowledge that the police themselves in these prisons are the site and the institutions which are propagating and doling out this sort of violence, right? The police, it's literally legal for police to rape, people that they have in their custody in many states in the country still. In prisons, we know that there is a rape culture.
Everybody hates rape until it's happening in prison, and then it's a joke.
And then we all laugh about it. Drop the soap. How many people have made a drop the soap, joke or whatever?
Jeffrey Epstein was going in there. That was the running gag. Like, absolutely. And in all these shows that you see, it's constantly, laughed at and joked at. So we those institutions are actually perpetuating things like rape. We covered a story not too long ago on the show where in New Jersey, in the New Jersey prisons, they were, they were beating and sexually assaulting, women. Men prison guards were sexually assaulting women prisoners in New Jersey prisons and raping and assaulting these women. And so police do this, police murder, police rape, prison, and within prisons, there is increased amounts of violence, murder, rape. So one, those institutions do not rid us of those problems, right? So right off the bat, we should first recognize that those are part of the problem of murder and rape. And as for Wall Street bankers and one in the society that we're talking about, we have to have more of a democratic society anyway. There will be no Wall Street bankers. Like the financial industry cannot exist in this situation. So we will never. We have to abolish Wall Street when we abolish prisons and abolish the police. We have to abolish Wall Street as well simultaneously. It will never work otherwise. A big aspect, because I am pro abolition, police and prison abolition. I side way more on the side of restorative justice. Will always be more so what I lean towards than punitive. We shouldn't be looking to punish people. We should be looking to restore the victim, as well as restoring the abuser. Because there's some reason they committed that transgression. So how do we make them stop doing that? Is it like, if it's a smaller one, like robbery, why did they rob someone? That can usually be fixed some way other than sending that person to prison. If we make sure that people have jobs and can feed their family and provide for, then they don't need to rob. Some of those crimes go. You
see wealthy people like breaking and entering and shit like that. Do you see any wealthy people breaking and entering
with the exception of if they may have like kleptomania, some type of mental condition, at which then we need to go to. That's a mental health issue.
Mental health in increase. So this is it's about getting to the root cause of a lot of these issues. Is one one part of it. And then as to, what do you do about the, these folks? Well, one, we do hope to eradicate the vast majority of it through, supporting, cutting to the root cause of those issues first off. But then in the other case, there still can be institutions that we develop where we say, listen, if you violently attack another, one of our civilians, we have to protect the rest of society from that person in a way. And we absolutely could have institutions. We should build up institutions that work that way, but those institutions should not operate in any way, shape, or form like the institutions that exist right now, where they, like Kwame said, they are so punitive and not about rehabilitation, which is why we have such a high rate of recidivism in the United States versus, places around the world that treat their prisoners with some sense of humanity. When you strip away people's humanity, treat them as if they're inhuman and animals, surprise, surprise, people act like freaking animals and they do violent things.
Not to mention the fact that just the similar way when we say like abolish the police, we don't mean that we would have like just total lawlessness, like that we just run rampant. We would still have like a form of like community security or protection. We would still have the same way that we'd have that if we abolish prisons. We're just not gonna let like, oh, well, you killed someone, but we don't have prisons, so just don't do that again, you scamp, and just send them on their way. There's a whole process. And if, restorative justice doesn't work, then we have to have some way of handling that. But similar to how, because abolishing the police doesn't mean we'll not have it at all. It means we're abolishing the policing system we currently have and rethinking it from the ground up. Same thing with prisons. We would still have a system, but we need to rethink it from the ground up, because right now the only thing it's doing is, it's punitive and it's slave labor. So it's not, prisons aren't stopping murderers because like the murder rate, it hasn't dropped to zero yet. And how long have we had
that's
prisons?
Another great point, which is that
and
murder is still going on, even in the case of rape. Most rapes are not, those people do not wind up in prison. That's the reality, is that for most rapes, they are not even reported. And when they do finally get reported and brought to trial, they are unable to convict these people. So what do we do with the rapists? Whatever we're doing with them right now, because we ain't doing shit with them.
They're just walking right back on the street. I was going to say that I didn't want to, because like I kind of peep that. I was going to leave that for Awkward to cover, because I know that was part of it.
And that's what we'll pick up this conversation next week with Awkward. So for sure. So we'll pick up this conversation next week on prison and police abolition with Awkward. And so look out for that. We're going to have some more guests coming on. We got JB Font that's James Fauntleroy from the Fred Hampton Leftist will be on with us next Tuesday. We'll have Awkward coming on Wednesday. We're in talks with Justin Jackson from The Takeover to appear next week, hopefully. So we'll have some more for you on that. Of course, we have our weekly book segment on the Radical Democracy Show. It's a crossover that we're doing with, we're reading Democracy Matters with the Vanguard. So please check us out there. Like, subscribe, share. We need to grow the platform. Appreciate everyone for being here. Please support us in whatever way you can, if you can afford to do so. Coffee, Patreon, whatever way you can. We deeply appreciate it. We've held this stream going way too long, and we'll regroup and we'll figure out how to not let this happen again next time. So my apologies. You got any final thoughts before we sign off here, Kwame?
I just remember I have a kid that I need to take care of at some point. But no, I'm definitely happy to be here. I don't know if, as an aside, since, we can cut this off of the other part, if you showed up just to see the interview earlier, for those of you who may not have noticed, I guess I'll say it a little bit more officially. Officially calling myself the co-host. You'll be seeing a bit more of me around here in a more official capacity, some cool things that'll be coming down the pipelines. But
and this is a part of our effort to, like, we want, we're talking about building, democratic workplaces, and we advocate for workplace democracy, and we really want in cooperation and building cooperative economies, and we really are committed to that and trying to build a cooperative, independent left media. And that means, first, democracy, you can't do it alone. You can't do it solo. Then it's not democracy. You're just a monarch essentially. You're ruling yourself. So you need in order to be collective, you gotta have multiple people in there. And so we are trying to, we're trying to grow our ranks and also cooperate with other lefty, channels and media outlets as well, and to really begin to discuss how are we going to operate cooperatively and not competitively, where we're doing the same things and reenacting the same sort of capitalistic institutions and recreating these same capitalist institutions, and then somehow expecting a different result out of it, as if we're not going to to create the same thing that was essentially the cable news but just online. I don't want to do that. So in order to try to resist against that, I think that we have to start to think outside the box. And what Kwame and I are doing here, hopefully, is a continuation of that and a beginning of that. Having Kwame, sort of, we'll operate more, together, and we'll still maintain racist media, but Kwame will be part of Radical Democracy, and he's part of our crew here, and will join me for as many of these interviews and sessions and shows as he can. He's got more responsibilities than I do, so you won't always see him, but you will see him as often as he possibly can be here. So I'm really excited about that, and we are trying to grow our ranks. We need support. We need financial support. So please donate to the show. Help us out there. We got to go because we've been talking way too long. All right, Kwame got to go. We all got to go. Thank you so much to everyone. Peace.